ASP.NET Web Server Controls are really where it's at when it comes to ASP.NET Web development. The reason for that is server controls really boost your productivity. If you've ever had to output a table with a bunch of TRs and TDs and put the data in the proper spots, then you'll know that it takes a little bit of effort. At a minimum, you'd have to write the loops and write out the HTML to generate those appropriate tags. Well, in this section, I'm going to introduce the concept of a web control. And you'll hear me say web control, server control, those types of things. They're all very similar. But the whole goal in life of these controls is to generate HTML. Now you can use these to collect data, you can validate data, and of course display data. Really all they are, though, is classes. They have properties, methods, and events. So they're just standard .NET Framework classes that you can use in your ASPX pages. Now you can define these statically in the ASPX pages, or you can even create them dynamically in your code behind or code beside pages, your code separation. Now they can generate XHTML compliant code, and they're adaptive, meaning that they can target the browser based on what the browser supports, and they're very easy to use once you know the general process for how they work. Now there's really four main categories you can break down these web controls into. And all of these generate some type of HTML, and some actually output some JavaScript as well. So the first category is the more commonly used ones, and that's called a web server control. And you'll hear me just say the term server control quite a bit throughout this course. Now these are strongly typed objects. So as I mentioned earlier, these are actually classes, but they have properties that are very specific to the purpose of that class. So we'll be seeing those in just a moment. Now you can also have something called HTML server controls. Now these are more rare. These are simply HTML tags such as input type equals text for a text box, but then you'll throw the runAt equals server attribute on them. So Microsoft behind the scenes has some classes that match up with the core HTML tags. And these HTML server controls can be used to generate the HTML for those. Now, why would you want to do that over just going with the standard HTML tag? And the answer is by adding runAt server to it and giving it an ID, you can more easily manipulate it from the server side. So it's much easier to work with. Now, ASP.NET also has some support for validation controls, and we can do things such as maybe in a form you have a text box, and that text box is required. Well, there's a required field validator you can use. Maybe you have a date that has to be entered. Well, you can use a compare validator for that and set the type of it to a date comparison. You can even use the compare validator to compare two password text boxes. Oftentimes when you register for a site, you have to enter your password twice to make sure you did it right. So validation controls are built in out of the box. They provide a really easy way to make sure that users input the data you want. And we'll be talking about those next actually in this module. Now the final type of controls that you can have are user controls. Now user controls are custom, so they're not actually something that's built in. You have to write these. So at the end of this module we'll also have a section on how to write custom user controls, and if I had to sum it up, really what they are is a way to create a reusable control that you can share across multiple pages. The most common example given is a header or a footer that you want across multiple pages. Now when you go into Visual Studio, and whether it's the full version or Web Developer Express, you're going to have the toolbox, and we've seen this up to this point several times actually. And you can drag and drop the server controls onto the design surface, or even do it into the HTML, the ASPX page, if you're in source view. There's a lot of different server controls available, and I'm not going to read all these to you, but let's look at some of the general categories here. So these first two boxes that you see on the left have some of the more common, what I'll call core controls. Now these particular controls that you see here, such as image or calendar, these are web server controls, not the HTML controls where you simply add runAt equals server. In fact, all of these are the web server controls. So we have things like a calendar. Well, a calendar, if you had to write that from scratch, which I've actually had to do that back in the day, and it's actually pretty involved to do a calendar. The calendar that's built into ASP.NET, you can simply drag it on. It's very customizable. So you can have a small calendar, or you could even have a full page calendar where each day has different events that are listed. And that's all possible with that one control. A drop-down list, very common, and something that simply outputs select and option tags for you. That's another example of a web server control. If you want to do file uploads, well, on the client side, just pure HTML, you can always do that yourself with the input, but there's a file upload control that makes it easier. Kind of simplifies your life there. Now moving over to the right side, we have very robust support for data binding and grabbing data, getting it into your page and outputting it. So we have something called data source controls, such as the SQL data source control you can see here. We also have entity data source, which can be used against things like Entity Framework, which is one of Microsoft's data access technologies for getting data out of a database. We have charting capabilities. So if you want to generate pie charts or bar charts, you can actually do that right in ASP.NET by using one of these web server controls. And then one of my favorite controls that I use a fair amount is the grid view control. I showed an example of this earlier when I showed maintaining the scroll back position earlier in the module. Now in addition to data source controls, we have validation controls. I'll go into those more in the next section. Moving along, we have some site navigation controls. So we can do breadcrumb trails, we can do menu and tree view controls. So if you want to do a breadcrumb trail, there's a sitemap path that allows the user to see where they are within the overall site. We also have security controls. So if I want to create a login page, I don't even have to drag on a login, or I should say a text box for, say, the username and password. I can literally just drag on a login control and it does that for me. Or maybe I want to create a registration screen. There's a create user wizard control you can drag on. We'll also be talking about these later in the course. Then the final one I'm showing here is some of the AJAX controls. So if you want to very easily, without having to know any JavaScript, add the ability to do what's called partial page postbacks. That's the ability to have a part of the page updated, not have to during a postback, and not have to reload the entire page. Makes it very easy to work with. Now here's an example of some of the syntax of these controls I've mentioned. So as an example, a text box, very common. I use it probably almost every app I do. You'll notice we start with ASP:. That right there is a giveaway that this is a web server control. And then we always have run at equals server. So whether you're doing a grid view or a multi-view or a file upload or whatever it may be from those ones I just showed, those will always start with ASP:, then the name of the control. Now the big thing with the web server controls, in fact all of these controls listed here, you have to put the attribute run at equals server. That is required and something that you'll need to remember to put on there. Now the HTML server controls, these aren't ones I use as frequently, but an example would be a hidden, and you just want to easily get to the ID of that. You don't need anything fancy. There is an HTML hidden server control, web server control you can use as well, but let's say we just want to use the standard HTML tag, but I want to modify it or get to it easily on the server side, maybe when a form is posted back as an example. Well, everything on here is pretty standard. Input, type equals hidden, give it an ID, give it a name. But then by adding run at server, it exposes the ID to the server side. So ASP.NET, the framework itself, will let you get to this simply by saying hid_val dot, and then I can get to, for instance, the value of this. So I don't have to go into any posted back variables. I can just get to it by the ID. Very easy to work with. The next one is validation controls. Now, a validation control really is just a web server control, but it's obviously specific to validation. So the validation control you see here is called the required field validator, does what it says. Make sure that end users have to enter some type of data for instance, a text box. So we know it's a web server control. It has the ASP:, it has the run at server, but then it has some other properties such as control to validate. This would validate against a control called txt name, which is probably a text box. Now the final one is custom. These are not built into the framework. These are ones that you'll have to build. So in this case we'd have a file, And the file would actually be called header.ascx, not ASPX, but ASCX. And then you have to define the namespace and the assembly and some other stuff of where that file is, if it's in a separate one. Well, user controls normally are just basic files that you can add in to your ASPX pages or your master pages to do things like creating consistent headers. So if you just want to define the header in one spot, there's a couple ways to do that. But one of the ways is to create a user control, or maybe you have a section of a form that's repeated across multiple pages, and you don't want to keep typing that over and over and cutting and pasting. So if you're familiar with include files, this is very analogous to what an include file is. Now that we've talked through some of the key aspects of server controls, let's take a little bit closer look. So as I mentioned earlier, every web server or HTML server control will always have run at equals server. That is a requirement. Now if it's a web server control, these are the more robust classes that Microsoft wrote that generate HTML, then you'll always have ASP: as the namespace prefix, and really all this does is simplifies having to type out, or prevents having to type out, a longer namespace. System.web.ui and then you get into web controls. You can give these IDs so we can programmatically get to them, or even on the client side we can get to these. And then in this case, because it's a label control, we have a text property. Now that is a strongly typed property. It's a string where you can say what is the text of the label. Now oftentimes if you know the text and it doesn't change, you don't need to use a label. Just type it into your ASPX page like you would an HTML page. So normally when I use label controls is when I need to dynamically output some text to a page. I'll throw in a label and then I'll give it an ID. Then in my code behind or code beside page, my code, I'll write some code to get to, in this case, LBL hello, label hello, dot text. And I can assign the value dynamically. Another one is the grid view that I mentioned. So you'll see ASP: grid view. We know it's a web server control, has an ID, has run at server. That's kind of a broken record, something you'll always see with server controls. Now in the case of a grid view, it's a very robust control, has a lot of properties, a lot of things you can do with it, including templates for the data that you're going to bind into it. So you'll see we can set things like the border color, cell padding, cell spacing. This outputs a table by default, and we can use these properties to control what's being written out in that table. So very, very easy control to work with, and something that I use fairly frequently. Now the final thing we'll talk about with web server controls is the ability to hook up events. This is really, really key, and why, other than the fact that you have web controls which output HTML for you, why ASP.NET is so popular. When you work with these web server controls, many of them have a rich set of events you can tie into. Now some might only have one or two, but others like the grid view control have quite a few events that can fire. If you're new to events, an event is simply a notification that something happens. So the most simple one is when a button is clicked. How do you know the user clicked a button in the browser on the server side? Well, what happens is ASP.NET uses standard web technology. So we have a form tag, and we're going to throw in a web server control, which is a button. So in this example, you'll see we have a button here. Give it an ID, run at server. Very similar to what we've just covered. Now the text of the button is going to be submit, but when this button is clicked, it's going to cause the form to be posted back. What ASP.NET will do is look at that ID of the button, and if it's wired up on the server side to an event handler, then that event handler will be called. And that's all done automatically. You don't have to check for the presence of a button in the request.form or on the query string or whatever you're doing. It just automatically handles this for you. So in this case, you'll see that we're linking the event handler, which is called button submit click, to the actual button through this onClick equals, and then we give it the name. Now, when that button is clicked, the form posts back. ASP.NET will then automatically invoke button submit click. It'll pass in the sender, which would be the object, and there won't be any event args in the case of a button. And then in this case, we're going to update some label called label message.text to you click the button submit button. So events are extremely powerful because it's almost like doing desktop programming. You can literally in Visual Studio double click on a button, handle that click event in the event handler, and then write the code that you want to run when that event handler is invoked. So let's take a look at how we can use the different types of controls that are available in ASP.NET, and take a look at a few of those and how we can handle events as well. Let me demonstrate how you can get started using web server controls in your ASP.NET applications. So I have Visual Web Developer Express open, and we're going to create a new project. Now I'm going to create an empty web application in this example, and let's go ahead and call this using web controls. And we'll go ahead and save that. Now that'll generate our project, and because I did an empty one, we don't have anything. So I'm going to right click, and we'll do add new item. We'll do a web form, and I'll rename this to default.aspx. Okay, so you can see we get our standard code, and we're ready to go here. So we have a form tag first off. You'll notice this has run at equals server. Now that is an HTML server control, and you do need to leave the run at server there. That's an important part of the overall framework. So let's say that we would like to design a simple form to capture maybe a user's first name, last name, and the state they're from. So to do that, I'm going to switch over to Design View to speed up some of the process here. Let's do a table real quick, and we'll do a couple rows. So first thing we do is we need first name, last name, and state, and then we also need an area for the button to be able to click it. So we'll do 4 rows. And we'll just do the 2 columns here. Alright, so that'll give me a real quick table to start working with. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm just going to type in first name. We'll do last name, state, and then we'll have a place for the button down in here somewhere. Let me move that over a little. Okay, so now we'll come to the toolbox, and I'm just going to go to the standard controls that you see here on the left, and I'm going to drag in a text box for here. We'll drag in another one right there. I'm going to put a drop-down list for the state. Let's come down to the up to the drop-down list actually, and we'll then add a button. And then when this button is clicked, I'm just going to hit enter a few times, and I'm going to throw a label in here. We'll write out what the user actually typed. We'll echo it back to the page. So I'm going to come to the properties of that label. We'll take out the text, but I'm going to give it an ID of, let's do actually output label. Let's work through these controls. So this is a web server control. These 4 controls that you see here, and then label is as well. So I'm going to come up to the text box. The first thing I'm going to do is give it a better name. So let's call this first name text box to be pretty obvious about what it does. This will be last name. For the states, we'll call this states dropdown. And for the button, don't really have to do much with it, but we'll just call it submit button. And I'm going to change the text of it to submit. Now, everything I've just done is modifying the properties of these controls. And remember, these are just classes. It's just that they're specialized type of web classes that can generate HTML for us. So if we go to source view, you'll see that the ASP:\text box was used for our text boxes. There's that run at server. Here's the IDs I just did. Here's my drop-down list. We're going to come back to that, add a couple states. And then finally we have the button and the label. So the nice thing about this is if I run it as is, let's go ahead and we'll do a build here. And incidentally, you actually don't have to build if you only change the ASPX, if you're using a web application projects. The code in here will automatically be picked up. So I could just right-click, view in browser. I like to build often though, make sure I don't have any issues. Alright, and that's what we get out of the box. Now if we look at the source, we can come down and you'll see that it output the appropriate type of HTML control tag. So we have an input, type equals text, input type equals text. Here's our select. We don't have any options yet. We'll get to that. Here's our button, and here's our label, which is a span tag. And then wrapping all of that up here at the top, we have a standard form tag that redirects back to, the action will go back to the same page itself. Alright, so let's go back to the drop-down list now, and I'll do this visually because it's pretty easy. And I'm going to click on the drop-down list, and I could do one of two things to add some hard-coded options. I could right-click and go to Properties, and then we can come down into the Items and click this little ellipsis button. That will let me add in items. Now that's one way to do it. The easiest way to get to it, though, is to highlight it. Click the little smart tag. Anytime there's a smart tag, take a look what that does, because notice we can do edit items right here. That takes me to the same screen. So it saves me a few clicks if I go through the smart tag. So I'm going to hit add, and let's just add some text and some values. So we'll do Arizona. Let's do California. And we'll do New York. All right, now maybe above that I want a select one to make them select something. But I don't want a value on that, we'll say. I want it to say select one, but I don't want a value. Now I'm going to hit these little arrows to move select one up to the top. And so there we have our hard-coded states, and I simply hit OK. Now if we go back to the source view, you'll see that it added something called a list item. Now a list item actually in this case will translate to an option tag in HTML, but what's nice about it is I didn't have to really type a whole lot except for the values. So I'll view in browser, and now you'll notice I have my select one with my options. And if we view source, as mentioned earlier, the whole goal in life of a web server control is to output HTML. So you can see it output the select tag, there's my ID, and my options. You'll even notice that right now the value of select one is not quite what I wanted, so we're going to come back and fix that. So we're going to come in, and for the value here, what you can do is actually come in and say value equals, and I'm going to force it to an empty string so that if we do validation, we can check did they type any or select anything or not. So let's view in browser. Let's view source. And now you'll notice that it does have an explicit value of empty string here because of what I went in and added. Now, real quick while I'm on that, I could have also come in and saved a little bit, although I'd have to type this manually. And we could also say text equals select one. And then we could do a shortcut close tag on that. Now, you'll notice I don't have run at server on this, and that's because the parent is already running at the server, so you don't have to put it on these particular child tags. Now, the tag I have here is the same as really one of these. If you just want to put out Arizona, there's no need to put value equals Arizona and text equals Arizona. You can actually save yourself a little bit. But in cases where you want to take over control and you're going to be typing it, this is what I'll usually do in this case. Okay, so running it again, we can now type into the text boxes, we can select a value, but the button doesn't do anything here. All right, I'm going to hit no for autocomplete. It just posts back, but nothing's really happening. So to fix that, let's talk about events. Now, there's a couple ways to handle events in ASP.NET. One way is, in the case of a button click, I can simply double click on it, and that will take me to the code beside or code behind file and give me an event handler out of the box. Just very easy. But another thing that is nice to know about is if I go to the button, you'll notice over here in the properties, I can come in and change any property of that button I want. But there's a little lightning bolt right here at the top. So if I click on that, you'll notice there's a couple different items I can click on here. So data binding, dispose. Now for a button, you'll generally not use these others. Maybe, but generally not. The one we'd want is click. So if I want to add a event handler for the click, I can double click on it here. That's one option. But the easiest way for a button is to simply double click on it right in the designer. That makes my event handler. So the reason I want to point that out, though, going back to the properties window with the lightning bolt here, is while the button only has a click that's very useful, there's going to be other controls such as the grid view, details view, and others that they have a lot of events. So you can't just double click on them in the designer. You'll typically go to the properties, click on the lightning bolt, and then you'll select the event and just double click. In fact, if I double click on it, you'll notice right now it's directing me to that event handler. If I double click on it here, it'll actually take me right back to it, which is very nice. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to take this, this, and this, and when they click the button, handle that callback when it's posted, and update the label with those values. So let's go ahead and do that. The way we'll do that is we'll come into here, and now we need to grab the text values. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll just create some basic values for first name, and we're going to say that first name is from the text box, and we have first name text box dot text. So I can go to the ID of the web server control and then go to the property to programmatically get to the value that was posted back. Again, I don't have to go into the form collection if you're used to doing it that way. So let me go ahead and type these out. So we'll do last name is last name textbox.text, and then let's grab the state. Now the way we do that is I need to go to the drop down. So we can go to states drop down, dot, and I have a couple selected options here. I can do selected item. We don't want that in this case, but I can also do selected value. All right, now the value will be literally that behind the scenes value associated with a select tag, or the options. So we'll go ahead and say selected value. Now we want to write all these out to our label. So we can simply say output label dot text equals, and I'll just concatenate them. It won't be too pretty, and we'll just add some spaces between them. Alright, so you can see with a very minimal amount of code, I am able to capture the data from the form, store it in some variables, and then write those out to our label. Now, if this were a database-driven app, we'd probably send this along its way and we'd update the database. We'll be talking about data access technologies in this course a little bit later. So let's go ahead and do a build now because we have modified code at this point. Looks like it builds okay. So now we can right-click on it to view it in the browser. Alright, so we'll go ahead and enter name, enter the state, hit submit, and you'll notice that it automatically writes that out. Now if we analyze what's been done here, depending on what framework you might have done web development in, or maybe you haven't and you're brand new to this if you've done desktop development. What I just did here is pretty close to desktop development. I can visually design my interface, I can double click on things to create events, and then I can get to my controls by simply typing the ID of the control and then get to the control properties. Really, really nice. I know when I first moved from classic ASP into ASP.NET way back in the day, this pretty much blew me away because we couldn't do it this easy. We had to go into the request variables and get these variable data out. Very, very easy to work with. So that's an introduction to working with server controls, working with properties, defining them within the ASPX page, and then also handling events so that we can write out the data from the server controls. In addition to the core controls that ASP.NET Web Forms provides, there's also a set of more rich controls that can output lots of different types of HTML. Now one of those is the grid view control, very commonly used control that can output tables. Now it's located in the data section, and we'll be revisiting that particular control as we get to the data access modules in this course. But I want to show how easy it is to get started with the control and show that you really have to write very, very little code, that it's very productive to use. So to demonstrate it, let me go ahead and right click on our project and we'll add a new item. And I'm just going to call this grid view demo. And we'll add that in. Now from here I'll switch over to design view. We're going to drag on the grid view, drop it on our page, and we get a smart tag that pops up. Now again, a smart tag allows you to modify typically properties or other settings of a control. But what's nice about this one is I can actually go in and modify the format of it, how it looks. So there's a lot of different built-in styles, and you could certainly go beyond this. This is just some starter ones, but you can customize it any way you'd like. So we'll hit OK there. Now just like the text box and button, I can go to properties, and this control happens to have a pretty rich set of properties. It also has a rich set of events. You'll notice there's quite a few here. But we're going to come into the ID, and I'll call it customers grid view. All right, now let's say that when this particular page loads, I want to go ahead and grab some names and bind it into this particular item, this grid view. So I'll right click and go to view code, and in our page load event, once that page loads, and that means the children, such as the grid view, are ready to be acted upon to add some dynamicness to them, we can come in and create a collection of names and bind it. So I'm just going to create a very simple one here. We're going to use a list of string. And I'm going to do a simple for loop. So we'll do the code snippet for that and do for tab tab. Have that pop it in. We'll do 99, and I'm just going to say names.add, and we'll add in John Doe plus I's value, just to give it some differentiation between names. Okay, now that'll create the loop for me, but we obviously need to get that data into our control in the page so it renders. Right now, if we go back to the page, we literally have a grid view, and if we look at the source for this, you can see it put out a bit of code for us. So all these different styles are being set based on that earlier style format I picked. But we don't have anything as far as data that this is going to render. And if we run it right now, you actually won't see anything. So we'll come back into our code behind, and now go to Customers Grid View, and we're going to assign to what's called the data source property. Now the data source property takes an IEnumerable collection, anything that we can iterate through, such as names. And that alone won't be enough though. We need to actually call a method called databind for it to actually kick in and then render the HTML back to the browser. So we'll say customersgridview.databind. But that's it. It literally takes 2 lines of code to assign data into this control and then have it do its thing. So let me go ahead and build this. Looks like we're good there. So now we can right click, view in browser, and we should just get a 1-column grid. Now if we go to the source for this, you'll see that it allows us to really do a whole bunch of work with just a minimal amount of effort on our part. So it's generating all the table tags that we need to output this particular table. There's the start of it right there. And you can see it's also applying some CSS styles here. So that's an example of another control, an items control, that we can use in ASP.NET and how easy it is to get started with it. Now we could just as easily apply these names that we created to other types of controls as well. So let me come into here, and I'll just comment this code out here, and we're going to do a server-side comment. Alright, so a server-side comment in ASP.NET looks like that. You can put the percent followed by 2 dashes and then dash dash percent on the bottom, and that'll stop it. So I'll switch to design view now, and let's look at some other types of controls that we can add. So in this case, I'm going to go on up, and we'll go to the bulleted list. And so, as the name kind of suggests, this bulleted list simply spits out a list of bullets. Now we can hard code those by clicking Edit Items, and this would be much like using the drop-down list we did earlier, but we can also bind to it. So let's go to Properties, and we'll change this to Customers List, we'll call it. And we'll go back into the code, comment out this section right here. You'll notice in this case I'm going to come up to the comment area, comment that out, and we can also come in and do the same exact thing. Then we'll call data bind. And that's it. It'll do the same exact thing you saw before, but this time it'll be a bulleted list. So let's go ahead and run it. And you can see we get our list. If we go back into our source here, you can see it did a standard unordered list that it added for us. So it does a lot of work for us. I didn't even have to write the looping code to take care of that. So there's many others we could do. There's a control called repeater, there's a list view, and others that are typically used in data access scenarios. So we'll talk about some of those later in this course.